today to our second SGP Gender Café with COFEM, the Coalition of Feminists for Social Change, to introduce their new Feminist Pocketbook. Christine, next slide. So in case you don't know about the Society of Gender Professionals, we currently have over 1,400 registered members around the world in 151 countries. So we're quite big and we're growing, so tell your friends, especially if you find this chat useful, which hopefully you will. Next slide. That's a nice map of where we're located. You can go next. So our mission is to promote the development of intersectional gender expertise for professional practice, strengthen connections between gender theory, policy, and practice, support collaboration between members, network building, mentoring, and leadership, foster the production and dissemination of applied gender research. And if you attended our first gender chat, we talked about publishing for gender practitioners. So if you have any questions about that, you can email us at the end of this cafe. Provide a platform for exchange of gender information and resources, and advance gender equality in member communities through coordinated feminist action. So Gender Cafes are a virtual conversation series connecting gender practitioners, academics, and activists to explore pressing gender issues and questions. The idea is that this is a non-hierarchical sharing, questioning, and learning platform that goes beyond the classroom. So don't hesitate to ask any questions in the chat box or let us know any comments or suggestions, because this is supposed to be open to everyone. And this is also a chance to develop professionally for members interested in raising the profile of their gender expertise. So the goals of the Gender Cafe are to introduce the latest research, emerging theory, innovative tools, and techniques so that we can all do better gender work in our professional and activist lives. We also would like to use this as an opportunity to connect SGP members, the places we work, the communities we live in, the organizations we support, and the issues that are important to us, as well as to unite the work of practitioners, academics, and activists by bridging disciplinary, geographic, and professional spaces and activities. And lastly, to spark new ideas, new theories, new research, and advocacy and social change strategies and new networks. So, can go. So my name is Leah. I currently work as a consultant for Raising Voices in Kampala, Uganda, and I am a co-founder of SGP, and I'll be moderating the session today. And next, I'd like to introduce speaker, if you can go to the next slide, Christy. Oh, I don't know where that is. So Jean, sorry, technical difficulties a little. So Jean is an internationally recognized expert on violence against women. She provides technical leadership, training, assessment, and monitoring to support UN agencies, INGOs, NGOs, and government partners in developing and improving violence against women-related research, policies, systems, and programs. She's currently based in, I won't be able to pronounce that, I know she's told me, Nanyuki, Kenya, and has consulted to over 30 countries around the world. She's the author of many publications on violence against women and has produced globally disseminated tools and guidelines. Recently, she led the revisions on the global guidelines on GBV for humanitarian settings, drafted a comprehensive web tool for UN Women on designing, implementing, and monitoring violence against women programming in humanitarian settings, and wrote the first ever comprehensive guidelines on coordinating GBV in humanitarian settings. She's taught at Smith College and Columbia University and will be introducing us to COFEM and the Pocketbook. So on to you, Jean.
Thanks, Leah. And thanks everybody for participating in this. It's so great to see so many participants on the sidebar. I am not going to be able to monitor the chat while I'm doing the presentation because I'm going to be reading off of another PowerPoint, not this one. So can I just ask our facilitators, if anything comes up in chat while I'm speaking, can you just please interrupt me and flag it for me? And can I encourage participants to feel free to write in chat as we go along if you have any questions about what I'm about to tell you. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce you to COFEM, just give you a little bit of background about COFEM, just as Leah's given some background on the Society of Gender Professionals. And then I'm going to talk about what COFEM's been working on in the last year or so. And particularly, I'm going to focus on the Feminist Pocketbook, which is something that COFEM is publishing in the next couple of weeks. And you all just happen to be the first folks who are officially outside of COFEM hearing about this, this product. So it's really, we're very excited to be able to share this with you today. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Feminist Pocketbook. And then we're just going to try and walk you through some of the tip sheets, which I'll explain in a minute, the tip sheets within the Feminist Pocketbook, and highlight some of the key concepts that are discussed there. Our hope is that not only can our highlighting the various presenters highlighting the key concepts provide an opportunity for discussion today, but it also whet your appetite for reading the Feminist Pocketbook when all of the tip sheets are released. So let's just jump in first. And let me just say we have other speakers. We have some wonderful other speakers on the line who will be speaking about different elements of the Feminist Pocketbook. So I'm just doing the introduction and then we'll shift over to other colleagues. Okay, so let's start with who's COFEM. So shifting to the next slide, COFEM, as Leah mentioned, stands for the Coalition of Feminists for Social Change. COFEM is a network of practitioners, researchers, activists, academics, working globally and primarily in humanitarian and development settings to end violence against women and girls. The network is fairly informal and has grown organically from 70 members in September 2017, which was around the time, you know, in mid 2017 was when we really sort of kicked off our activities, to around 100, I think 170, I may be inflating that a bit, but 170 members as of October 2018. We're a volunteer-run network. It's a membership network, so it's the COFEM members are invited by invitation, are invited by other COFEM members, and the work that we do is done almost exclusively on a voluntary basis. So we have 2 part-time positions to oversee, coordinate, and implement all aspects of COFEM activities. We have a COFEM coordinator, and then we have someone who works with the 2 people who actually work with the COFEM coordinator on a very part-time basis to support the work. And then we have a coordinating committee, and the coordinating committee is made up of 6 members who volunteered when COFEM was started to oversee the management of some of the decision making that needs to happen efficiently within COFEM. So everything that we do, the point that I want to emphasize there is everything that we do is pretty much voluntary. We are now funded by Novo and Wellspring for our activities. And we're, I think at the moment, operating with about a budget of around $300,000 a year, I think. So moving to the next slide. So COFEM came together, was created because there has been a sense in the GBV, VAW world for a long time that there's, I would say particularly in the last 6 or 7 years, that there's a kind of increasing backlash against a feminist-oriented and women-focused efforts to address violence against women in violence against women / GBV work. So we felt like we needed to use our expertise, those of us working on violence against women in humanitarian development settings, use our expertise to really do some targeted advocacy around issues of concern. So we came together, we had an initial preliminary meeting in 2016 and kind of loosely formed with just a few members in 2016, and then scaled up in 2017 with a more sort of organized approach. We determined that our core objectives are to do two things. One, to provide a forum for connection, for discussion, for problem solving, for mutual support, for those who are really, invested in advancing a feminist and women-centered perspective in work to end violence against women and girls. Because we felt like part of some of the results of the backlash that we were experiencing were that we were feeling very isolated and demoralized. And so we felt that opportunity to create community was really a sort of critical aspect of a critical component of COFEM's core purpose. And then the other really important sort of core objective or core purpose of COFEM is that we work together to try and identify and implement strategies and actions to address the challenges that we're seeing in feminist-informed efforts to combat violence against women and girls. So moving to the next slide. So we identified sort of underneath those core objectives, we identified several key advocacy issues that we want, at least for the next couple of years, for COFEM to focus on or prioritize. So our advocacy work is particularly concerned with these issues, and you'll see this reflected in the Feminist Pocketbook when we get to it in just a minute. So we are interested in looking at the rise of gender neutrality within humanitarian discourse and practice, and that's particularly relevant, I think, to you all on the call today who are gender professionals. And I should say it's not just humanitarian discourse and practice, but we're seeing it particularly in humanitarian discourse and practice. And I know that we have one of our presenters is going to be talking about this a little bit more later, and so we can have some discussion around that. We also are looking at the issue of the emergence of competitive victimhood, like the notion that a specific focus on violence against women and girls in GBV work is exclusive or discriminatory, using kind of language that using a kind of sort of competitive victimhood approach to kind of advocating for addressing the needs of other populations within violence against women and girls work. We want to focus on a shift from women and girl-led movements and activism to more technocratic approaches to ending violence. So we're really seeing that, as someone who's been working in the humanitarian field very long, that there is a tendency really to not to pay enough attention to those underlying feminist principles that should drive violence against women and girls work, and to really take a more technical approach to scaling up technical capacity at the field level, rather than, for example, supporting women's really making so that would mean, for example, focusing on the delivery of clinical management of rape services over, for example, supporting women's movements and women's leadership. The CMR is really important, but there's been a kind of heavy focus on those more technical capacities rather than movement building, and so we want to address that as an advocacy concern. Another core concern is the rise in politically neutral interpretations of gender as well as GBV. So that sort of links back to that first bullet point of the rise of gender neutrality within humanitarian discourse and practice. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. Another point is a lack of clarity about how violence against women intersects with other forms of interpersonal and collective violence. And another point is the lack of feminist-informed analysis about how to include men and boys in efforts to eradicate violence against women and girls in a way that's accountable to, that should say women and girls, sorry, that's a mistake in the slide, in a way that's accountable to women and girls. If with these kind of advocacy concerns in mind, we have a number of activities that we're working on. If we can just move to the next slide. For these kind of, these are our advocacy points, and then the activities that we're working on. Sorry, hold on just a second. So one of the first things that we did in the public domain was to draft a series of discussion papers for the Sexual Violence Research Initiative Conference in Brazil, which was in September last year. The paper series, we developed a series of papers, and then we did a panel that's been recorded, and we also recorded some interviews with the authors of the paper series. The paper series and the space, and the paper series focused on sorry, hold on just a second, my screen just went full. Sorry guys, hold on just a second, having a technical issue. Okay. So in the SVRI paper series, which is called Feminist Perspectives on Addressing Violence Against Women and Girls, we look at some of these core advocacy concerns through a series of papers, each about five pages long. We also are in the process of finalizing the Feminist Pocketbook, and the Feminist Pocketbook is a series of tip sheets for people working on violence against women. The tip sheets were meant to try and sort of consolidate some of the key points in the SVRI paper series. So the paper series is a bit more detailed in the kind of elaboration of theory and of the core concerns. And the tip sheets are meant to be, 2 to 3 pagers that people can, the language is really basic, people can access the tip sheets and reference them in kind of to help them think about some of the core issues in maintaining a feminist perspective and doing work on violence against women and girls. Related to the dissemination of the Feminist Pocketbook, we're hosting what we're referring to as a Knowledge Summit, which will be a virtual learning event over the 16 days of activism this year. So we'll have 6 COFEM members giving holding 6 learning events that will be like this Gender Cafe will be open to the public. And it'll be a sort of virtual learning experience, a virtual classroom where the COFEM members will be kind of teaching some aspects of the Feminist Pocketbook papers tip sheets, and then the audience will have an opportunity to engage with questions and comments. And then, as I mentioned before, we're launching a website in the coming couple of weeks, which will be a repository of the COFEM resources that we are, that we're in the process of developing. Okay, so let's shift to the next slide, please. So now let's get into talking about the Feminist Pocketbook specifically, because that's what we're focusing on. We have, so I don't know if you saw on the other slide the URL for the COFEM website. But you'll be able to access some of the other materials that I referred to, the SVRI paper series, and of course the upcoming Knowledge Summit on the website. The Feminist Pocketbook, you'll also be able to access, and we're going to be doing some other sort of dissemination activities. But right now, this discussion is really to tell you about what you can expect in the Feminist Pocketbook and share with you some of the core concepts within the tip sheets. So the idea of the Feminist Pocketbook was to try and build the knowledge and the confidence and the competence of practitioners and researchers and other advocates working on violence against women / GBV work. It's the Pocketbook seeks to promote a common understanding, specifically grounded in feminist theory on a variety of issues and concerns. And it's intended to support practitioners in a women-centered advocacy, policy, and programming approach. Next slide. The tip sheet topic, so there are, as I mentioned, there are 10 tip sheets. The tip sheet topics are listed here. Why does a feminist perspective matter and work to prevent and respond to violence against girls? Why does GBV programming focus on women and girls? How do we connect gender-based violence, sexual harassment, and everyday sexism? How do we stay accountable to women and girls? What are feminist approaches in building knowledge and evidence on GBV? So that is related to research. A reflection, a tip sheet that reflects on men as allies and activists and what that means. A tip sheet that reflects on violence against men and boys and where that fits within sort of our work to address GBV or violence against women and girls. A tip sheet on trying to understand the risks and benefits of coordinated efforts to address different forms of violence. So what does it mean for the GBV community working on violence against women and girls to link with, say, for example, the child protection community working on violence against children, or the emerging communities trying to work on sexual violence against men and boys, for example, in humanitarian settings. The 9th tip sheet looks at backlash, what it is, and how we can address it safely. And then the 10th and last tip sheet is about feminist movement building and trying to take a long-term view. I'm really trying to help us all think, you know, all of us who are trying to promote feminist approaches in our work and, you know, experience how challenging it is, really trying to help us understand that this is a long-term sort of challenge that we're engaged in. And COFEM is really designed to help people try and try and give people the support that they need to be able to continue to engage in that long-term challenge. Okay, so shifting to the next slide, let's just very briefly, let's just review some of the points that are raised in the first tip sheet. Now, every tip sheet, I mentioned it's like every tip sheet is 2 to 3 or 4 pages, and each tip sheet starts with a sort of summary of the key topics within the tip sheets. And then at the very end, then they elaborate on those key topics, and then at the very end, they have recommendations that are targeted to different groups. So recommendations targeted to practitioners, recommendations targeted to researchers, recommendations targeted to donors, so that the tip sheets can really be used as for those who like, for those for whom it's useful, they can use the tip sheets as an advocacy tool. So on this PowerPoint slide, you'll see the key topics of tip sheet number 1. And the tip sheet number 1 focuses on the fact that the root cause of violence against women and girls is gender inequality. And a feminist perspective and work to end violence against women and girls helps us to focus on that fact, on the fact of gender inequality as a foundational or the foundational driver of violence against women and girls. Tip sheet 1 also talks about the fact that in the current climate of backlash against feminists, reasserting a feminist approach is critical to the success of work to end violence against women and girls. So tip sheet 1 really seeks to remind us that a feminist perspective to address violence against women and girls focuses on recognizing and tackling unequal systems of power. And a feminist frame for violence against women and girls draws attention to the ways in which interpersonal violence is underpinned and exacerbated by structural violence. Okay, moving to the next slide. Just a couple of points also in tip sheet 1. There are many different models of feminism that reflect different theoretical perspectives and lived experiences of women and girls across different geographies, across different contexts. What we as COFEM want to emphasize, we want to appreciate those differences, but we want to emphasize that all models share a common goal, and that is to define, establish, and achieve political, economic, personal, and social equality between the sexes, between males and females. So feminism is a movement and commitment to ending patriarchal domination for the benefit of all people. This is from COFEM's advocacy perspective. Having said that, we know COFEM very strongly supports an intersectional feminist approach. It's a core value emphasized throughout the tip sheets. And applying an intersectional feminist approach or an intersectional feminism to practice means ensuring that feminist activism and advocacy recognizes the different ways in which women experience oppression and inequality. Intersectionality is oriented explicitly towards transformation, building coalitions among different groups and working towards social justice. So COFEM tries to promote a recognition of the different and intersecting forms of oppression to open up opportunities for alliances among marginalized groups who share a common political interest in transforming gender inequality, and related forms of oppression. And you'll see this coming out very strongly in the remainder of one to highlight. Now, just moving to the next slide. So those are some of the key points in tip sheet 1. Tip sheet 2, I just thought I'd sort of talk about this super briefly because it's so relevant to all of you gender professionals. Leah, how much time do I have left?
Maybe about 1 minute.
Okay, that's great. So I'm just gonna run you very quickly through tip sheet 2 to try and entice you to read it when it's disseminated. Tip sheet 2 talks about why GBV programming focuses on women and girls. There are a lot of different interpretations of GBV, a lot of contested perspectives on what does and doesn't constitute GBV. We know that women's rights activists introduced the language of GBV to highlight discrimination and inequality as a root cause of violence against women and girls. And in so doing, they were seeking to emphasize that violence violence against women and girls is a fundamental human rights violation. So shifting from violence against women and girls to GBV by women's rights activists was a strategy for trying to underscore accountability of states to address gender inequality as part of their responsibility to protect and promote human rights of women and girls. However, some emerging definitions of GBV have sought to shift the focus away from the political project of ending structural gender inequalities toward a more neutral and depoliticized understanding of GBV. So related to the confusion about what gender-based violence is or isn't, there's emerged a lack of clarity about how violence against women intersects with other forms of violence, which, as I've noted before, is the focus of another tip sheet. So you can really see all of these tip sheets seek to be kind of interrelated and complementary in terms of kind of supporting each other and building a kind of holistic frame for what it means to ensure a feminist perspective in undertaking work on violence against women and girls. Okay, so next slide. Okay, so now,
Thank you so much. I said thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. So now what did anything come up in the chat? Let me just ask before we pass it off.
No, we're good on the chat right now.
Okay, great. So now we're going to pass it off to the panelists who are going to be doing a slightly deeper dive to some of the specific topics within the tip sheets.
Great. Thanks again, Jean. So
Sure.
I'm going to introduce Sharifa, who's an international development professional with 9 years experience, very passionate about human rights and gender equality. And she's led the work on gender, GBV, and protection with INGOs for emergency response. She has in-depth knowledge and experience on protection mainstreaming, SRHR, and HIV prevention, and holds a master's degree from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And she's going to be talking about, you can go to the next slide, Christy. She's going to be talking about staying accountable to women and girls. So on to you, Sharifa.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Jean, for the introduction and beginning, and thank you, Leah. First of all, I want to apologize because I have a cold, so I might be coughing and half dying, so excuse the cough and me dying halfway through my presentation. Tip sheet 4 really looks at accountability and thinking about accountability, women and girls. So before we even kind of go straight into the whole tip sheet, let's just talk about what do we mean by accountability to women and girls, particularly within, thank you very much, Carly, thank you. Let's just think about what's accountability to women and girls, particularly within humanitarian development work that we actually do. So first of all, what is accountability? So accountability has different factors. One of them is promoting and ensuring women and girls leadership in work on GBV. So making sure that we are actually allowing them to be leaders in their work, in the work on GBV. Second of all is also learning and acting on voices and experiences of diverse women. So for example, trying to capture a number of women within our programming. So not just speaking to one group of women, but also speaking to women with disabilities, speaking to women from different ethnic groups. So trying to capture all these voices and all their experiences into our work and actually learning from that and also acting on it. And last, and also prioritizing do no harm. I mean, I think that's the most key element is we have really good intentions, but I think sometimes we need to kind of reflect and think about, does this intervention I actually am thinking of doing, can it cause harm to the women and girls I would like to serve? And lastly, involvement of men and boys does not disempower or sideline women and girls. I mean, I think we need to make sure that women and girls are central to our programming, and involving men and boys is absolutely fine, but ensuring that women and girls are still central to our programming and still part of that and are empowered through that process. Next slide, please. So next slide is Tina. Okay, let me just carry on speaking until Leah tells me to stop. So we kind of talked about very key principles and I think one thing that I would like to kind of talk about, because there's many examples, is the do no harm and also prioritizing the needs of women and girls, their leadership, and trying to address and transform inequalities and transform that, and actively challenge gender inequalities and to transform patriarchy. I mean, there are many ways, and I think there are many examples of doing that, and there are different people that we can actually work with in doing that. So if we think about how we actually work, there's advocacy, there's programming, and there's policy. So if we kind of put all those little key elements that we talked about when it comes to accountability, there's many things we can actually work around in trying to increase accountability. So as we said, do no harm. So making sure the principle of no harm is actually central, and making sure we actually think and actually reflect about the women that we actually work with. If I kind of think about an example very recently, is everyone's kind of on the bandwagon on cash distribution and cash programming, and there was an organization where I'm working at the moment who wanted to do cash programming for pregnant women. And from the initial phases that was coming out, there was a number of young girls coming to those cash programs and saying, if I get pregnant and I'm 13, will I still get the cash? I mean, and no one actually did a risk analysis. No one actually asked the question, are we doing harm? So again, thinking about the programs that we actually do and making sure, are they actually doing harm, and are they preventing and mitigating risk to GBV? Prioritizing the rights and needs of women and girls. I think that, again, when we're thinking about GBV, it's not just about, you know, the technical stuff, we're making more CMRs there, case managements there, and so on and so forth. But also, what else can we actually do in increasing the protective environment of women and girls, increasing their rights and their access to rights and information within there. Also looking at advocacy and policy and trying to make sure that women are developing and increasing their participation in leadership within conversation, particularly within policies, to actually make sure that the environment is actually meeting their rights and needs. Going back again to promotion of women's leadership, and there's really great examples of that within programming. Again, in the context I'm working, and we're talking about where there's a lot of working with women and girls, and making them leadership, like leading the way, and working with architects and engineers in designing wash facilities that will cater to their menstrual hygiene management, and also their safety and dignity, and their safety, particularly when accessing bathrooms and wash facilities. But then that was led by women, and that was actually incorporating their voices and experience and within this programming. So I think there's many great examples, many great tools that we can actually promote women's leadership and and ensure that our program is inclusive of women, and particularly women of different varieties. I think we keep on talking about we're engaging women and girls, but I think what we forget is that there's so many different layers of women and girls, and we forget about that intersectionality, and forgetting that there are disabled women, there are women from different ethnicities that might experience different types of violence and might not, and have different types of rights and privileges. So ensuring that they too are involved in those conversations, and we are also actively involving them and increasing their leadership and their participation within the programming, and particularly within advocacy and policies.
Great. Sorry. Thank you so much, Sharifa, for sharing your experience with us. I am going to ask you if you want to send any resources to us that we can share with members after. That you mentioned there are some great tools on women's leadership. So if you want to send that over at any point, I know you're very busy, but we can forward those along to the attendees today. So thank you so much, and I hope you feel better.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Okay, Tina, are you on? I'm really hoping. Tina's been traveling, so I want to make sure that she's on. Tina? We might move on if she is not. Okay, I don't see Tina at the moment, so let's move to Divya for now. So I'd like to introduce Divya, who's a feminist researcher and independent consultant specializing in protection against sexual exploitation and abuse, violence against women and girls, migrant workers' rights, and gender mainstreaming. Divya holds dual master's degrees in public administration with a specialization in gender, human rights, and humanitarian policy from Columbia and the National University of Singapore. She also worked as a knowledge broker at the UNDP Global Center for Public Service Excellence in Singapore. And in 2016, she co-authored a book on cost of living, wages, and purchasing power indices for expatriates and ordinary citizens in major cities. She currently works as the coordinator for COFEM, building a strong intersectional feminist foundation for COFEM's advocacy and research activities. So on to you, Divya.
Thank you very much, Leah, and thank you, Jean and Sharifa. I am very excited to be speaking on 2 tip sheets today. So I'm not sure how we are doing for time, Leah. So can you just let me know how much time I have to?
Yeah, you have about 6 minutes.
Okay, great. So I will make this very quick. So I will be speaking on 2 topics, and they would be the backlash topic as well as the feminist movement building. And as you know, both of these issues are intertwined. So I'm not going to take too much time on tip sheet number 9 because we'll be getting back to these concepts when I speak about feminist movement building. And I'm sure backlash is a concept that all of us on this call, we have all experienced this, at multiple levels in different forms. So I don't think I need to go into detail, but just to let everybody know, this is a great tip sheet if you want to explain what backlash feels like, especially when you are doing work to promote gender equality, to respond and prevent to, gender-based violence. So I think this tip sheet is a very good starting point for people to really understand how unforgiving and exhausting that this work can be. And one of the things that this tip sheet does is that it really outlines what exactly do we mean by backlash and the spectrum of, actions that would constitute backlash. And some of you would have faced this in your workplaces or in conversations with your friends and family online. And it's really interesting to see the way, this tip sheet actually breaks down the different sort of stages of backlash. So you have people who would, be at the denial stage. There are people who would co-opt language that is used by feminists to undermine what we actually mean. And then there is also appeasement, where people tend to say, well, that's not a priority right now. We don't want to be focusing on that. And all the different, varying degrees of backlash that one faces. And I guess it's also important to remember that in the slide you would see a photo. I got this from a digital library archive. And this is just to sort of illustrate that, backlash against women's rights movements and feminist movements, it's been there forever, and it has a very long and painful, violent history. Unfortunately, we don't have time to unpack that, but I strongly suggest that perhaps we should have a gender cafe on that topic in itself. But what this tip sheet does is that it provides guidance, and it also helps you to strategize on how to address backlash and resistance to work on gender equality. And I'm not sure, there might be GBV practitioners on the call today. And you would be very pleased to know that we have made it a point to really sort of outline what some of these strategies are. So on this slide, you will see that we have framing. And this is something that everyone who is involved in gender work would know. How do we frame certain issues so that is, maybe perhaps the word is not more palatable, but how do we frame issues so that we can really get people on board? Let's, to sort of have a shared understanding of the underlying issues. At the same time, the tip sheet also highlights the importance of not using frames that speak only to the utility of women and girls. So this is, again, we see a lot of the utility argument in, the economic argument for women's empowerment, and, how it's so important to invest in women because it's good for GDP, not because they're just women. So the tip sheet really gets into these different strategies, and at the organizational and community levels, it's important to build solidarity and alliances. And just to take COFEM for example, like Jean was saying, I mean, there was a community of practitioners who really felt that, this backlash was reaching a stage where we really needed to come together and strategize, and to also think about, we need to have an aligned strategy. How are we going to respond? How are we going to plan to respond to anticipated backlash? So building solidarity is a concept that this tip sheet talks about. And then, of course, teaching and learning. I mean, it's also important to recognize that not everybody has a degree or specialization in feminist theory or, gender and public policy. In fact, that in itself is a shortcoming, because, I mean, where I studied, not at Columbia, but the other place, there was a huge resistance in incorporating a gender analysis into a lot of the public policy programs. And I used to be the lone voice in the room advocating for this, and I faced a lot of resistance from professors and other teaching faculty, saying that of course we talk about women, of course we talk about power. That's the reason why we don't ever have to use those words, because those are implicitly implied. Of course, we all know what that means. That's just a very good way of saying thank you, but no thanks. We are not going to talk about, feminist theory in classes that are focused on public policy, because there is no room for feminism here. And I think that example that I've just shared would resonate with most of you, because in the work that we do, and again, the reality is right now, a lot of the GBV response and programming on the ground is led by mainstream INGOs. And I will talk more about feminist movements and local and national movements in my next slide. So I'm just going to keep that point for that. And then the last thing is, of course, prioritizing self-care as a strategy to mitigate and manage backlash. We all know how unforgiving this work is, and the past couple of weeks must have been, everyone knows what went on and how emotionally tiring, and how relieving the trauma takes on, a completely different level of mental toll. So it's really important to really prioritize self-care, and we all know that that is political warfare. And this tip sheet really gives you, all of strategies that help someone to cope with backlash, especially as a GBV practitioner. And I think it's also important because not many people understand the magnitude of backlash. So can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so in this slide, I will be talking about feminist movement building, and it's very important for me to also just, highlight that it's something to think about. All of us are familiar with spaces, especially agenda setting spaces in the global north, that might not necessarily prioritize or insist on participation of local and national feminists or women's rights advocates. And this, of course, goes, it speaks to a broader problem of the shrinking space and funding. So what this tip sheet really does is it tries to speak to the importance of local and national feminist and women's movements to catalyze political and transformational change. And it offers tips for supporting local women's movements to be at the forefront of efforts to address and to end GBV. And the problem is, right now, and again, I don't think I have to go into detail because I'm sure a lot of you know this from your work, that the shrinking space, together with donor demands, there is always demand for, short-term quantifiable impact. And this is really problematic when you think about, ending patriarchy or smashing the patriarchy is a daily process, and there is no shortcut to that. And if we are talking about gender inequality, we need to be ready for the long haul. And so there is this sort of, there is this, I guess the word that I'm trying to look for is, it's a bit disjointed, because we have donors who say that, listen, we are going to fund something if if we can see results, but changing social norms, it doesn't fit into a donor cycle. It takes longer than that. And so what happens is you have a lot of women's rights organizations that are not at the forefront of these efforts. They are not leading efforts to end GBV and to prevent, to respond to these issues in their communities. And what happens is that is when you dilute the political and transformative dimensions of GBV work. And this then leads to an over-reliance on technocratic and short-term quantifiable programming. So what the tip sheet does is it really outlines some of these issues, the key challenges that feminist movements face at the moment against this backdrop. And the other thing that is also important to note is this tip sheet also talks about, it sort of contextualizes the shift away from long-term investment in local, national, and international women's movements, despite research showing that it is women's movements that drive progressive policy and social change around women's rights. So on this slide, you can see there was a global study conducted in 2012 that demonstrated the presence of a strong and autonomous feminist movement was the single most important factor in catalyzing action to recognize and address GBV in a country. So given that, everything that's going on in the world today, COFEM, as well as other organizations, we really feel that this is something very important. We need to do everything that we can to amplify the voices, agency, and leadership of women and girls, because they know what works in their communities. They know what works to prevent violence against them. And if we're not listening to them, and if they're not at the center of our efforts, then that is really problematic. If we can go to the next slide. And as Jean mentioned earlier, so intersectionality as a concept, I just want to also emphasize that each of the tip sheets have case studies. So we actually have real life examples substantiating, the research that went into each of the tip sheets. And so feminist movement building, and I think this is something very important for all of us to think about. I mean, who has access to these critical agenda setting spaces? Whose voice matters? And are we really critically reflecting on our privilege, as women from the global north, or as women from a specific, of higher caste? Or if are we thinking about, how much space we are occupying in some of these movements? Are we stepping back to allow others to come to the front? And the tip sheet also makes a point to say that feminist movements must amplify the voices of women who are historically marginalized and support women leaders from diverse backgrounds. And it's also, in a way, I think it's great that we recognize that, progressive social movements, including feminist movements, are not immune to discrimination and inequality. There are internal power hierarchies and there are privileged groups or members. And there are people who exclude the voices of diverse and marginalized women. And so this tip sheet highlights that, and it really brings to the fore this question about power, agency, access. And I think it's a very important point to be made, because as a younger feminist and as someone who's been working not in, overtly feminist organizations, and now that I have switched to a very feminist, openly feminist organization, I've been thinking a lot about this, and I've been thinking a lot about my own experiences in all these agenda setting spaces. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge that this is an issue that we need to have honest conversations about. And I'm really glad that, COFEM is raising that issue in this tip sheet. And if I can go to the next slide, please.
And Divya, you have about one minute.
Yeah, that's the last slide, no problem. And so this is the last slide, and I wanted to end this, I think I'm the last speaker unless Tina is online now, but I really wanted to sort of end this on a very positive note, because I feel that, we've really, there's been so much progress despite everything, and we really need to sustain the movement, and we need to sustain the momentum. And in the tip sheet, we talk about promoting local knowledge and why, valuing local knowledge over technocratic, fly in, fly out, expertise is important. And then also ensuring diverse female leadership, building feminist alliances, sharing knowledge, and really coming together from all around the world and, speaking with a unified voice on shared vision and goals. And I think it's important to remember that a lot of the organizations that, who is convening feminist activists, practitioners, researchers, they are doing, amazing work, given that everything that's been happening, shrinking space, lack of funding. But we need to continue doing this work, and it can be extremely difficult sometimes. And for COFEM, I think this Feminist Pocketbook is a first step in really sort of articulating a lot of these issues as they relate to the violence against women and girls work. And yeah, on that note, I think I hope that you've enjoyed today's presentation, and I hope Tina would be able to share her section, because I think that's very central to our discussion today. And Leah, can I talk about the Knowledge Summit very quickly? Is that okay?
Please,
okay.
plug for it.
Yeah, so can I go to the next slide? I know we are running out of time, but Jean mentioned this earlier, but I just wanted to, do another plug. So the Knowledge Summit will be going through some of the topics that we discussed today, and we highly encourage you to keep an eye out. Our website will be up soon, where we will be launching the Feminist Pocketbook, so that it would be ready for you to download and to share with your networks. And the Knowledge Summit will have we will have 6 classroom style sessions, and the registration will be open hopefully in the first week of November. And yeah, we look forward to you joining us there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Divya. We didn't even get to touch on all of the topics that we wanted to. I think Tina, she's in Nairobi, so she was having trouble with internet connection, but she was going to speak about engaging men and boys. So it's unfortunate we don't have her, but perhaps I can have her write something brief that we can send out so she can share her experience.
Can I just, Leah, do we have time to go through the slide?
We can go over brief. We have a minute. I mean, if people can stay on for an extra 5 minutes, we can definitely go through.
Oh, are we ending now? I thought we had 2 hours. We only have an hour.
Yeah, it's an hour.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I totally got that wrong. Okay. So this is just that tip sheet is on men as allies, and of course it links to the whole kind of issue around male engagement. So I won't focus on it since we only have a minute left, but maybe flagging the tip sheet will pique people's interest, so that they'll be encouraged to read that tip sheet when it is published.
Yeah, here's some brief information about it. Yeah, I'm sorry. There's never enough time when we start talking about feminism. I feel like it goes all over, and I wanted to actually touch on some other issues with Divya that we unfortunately don't have enough time to discuss. But if anyone still here has any last minute questions before we end, I just want to also say thank you to our panelists and thank you to COFEM. The Pocketbook is amazing, and really excited to see the final product.
Leah, can I make a suggestion? Is it possible, just if I feel badly that we might be sort of logging off without people having the opportunity to ask any questions. Should we just see if anybody has any burning questions for those who are able to stay on an additional 5 minutes?
Yeah, that's no problem. I'm still on for 5 minutes, and if Christy's okay staying on for 5 minutes, I asked the message, but in the group chat, but no one seemed to say if they had any questions.
Okay.
But
All right. Maybe they don't.
Yeah, if anyone wants to add any more questions on the side. Also, if anyone wants to, I don't know what happened to Christy's shared screen, but you guys are also able to create your own gender cafes. So let us know. I'll type in our email address. Christy, if you want to go to the last slide, we have the information, the contact information for both COFEM and SGP in case you guys have any questions, suggestions, and don't forget to keep an eye out for the Knowledge Summit as well.
This is Christine. I also just wanted to say, while I was taking notes, I really loved the idea that came out to have another a gender cafe on backlash, and I'd love to see one on framing strategies. How do we do that? What does that look like in different contexts? So if people want to send in emails via the SGP email and let us know if you would be interested in participating or have something to share, I'd love to collect ideas for future gender cafes on those ideas in particular.
Yeah, and the other one that I wanted to add, which is an issue I didn't get to speak about with Divya, was intergenerational feminism, especially kind of how the younger feminists are entering the field and how we're working across different generations. So I think that's another great topic.
Absolutely.
And definitely one on backlash because we can talk forever.
Yeah.
But if there are no questions, then I think that we can end here. I'll give it maybe one more minute. Or if anyone else, if you want to share anything, feel free.
I'll also just remind everybody that we have recorded this session and we are saving the chat message, so we'll make that available to members. So if you want to review any of the information or share this with other members, we'll make that eventually available when we have our new website up and running.
Great.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks.
Yes, thank you to everyone. It was a great presentation.
When I see Tina just came on, but I'm not sure if her audio is working.
I'm going to stop the recording now. Thank you everyone for participating today. We hope to see you at future cafes.